He bought a legend. Matt Rife, a comedian known for quick humor and crowd interactions, now holds the keys to one of the most infamous homes in paranormal history. The world was stunned when news spread that he had purchased the property that once belonged to Ed and Lorraine Warren, the couple who inspired the Conjuring universe and who spent decades cataloging the darkest artifacts of supernatural lore. This was not simply a purchase of land and walls. This was the inheritance of nightmares, of cursed objects, and of shadows that do not rest quietly. Please consider subscribing and give this video a like. Down in the comments, let me know what haunted place you want me to cover next. Now let's get back to the horror. The announcement came in August 2025. It sounded more like the script of a horror film than a real estate transaction. Matt Rife, alongside YouTuber Elton Casti, had finalized the deal under an entity called Haunted Homes, LLC. They became legal guardians of the artifacts that filled the Warren Occult Museum. Among them rests Annabelle, the infamous doll that inspired countless stories of possession, malevolence, and inexplicable terror. The number itself was eye-catching, roughly $1 million for the property, but the real weight came not from money. It came from history, belief, and a long list of objects that many people will not even stand near without saying a prayer first. This is not just real estate, this is a vault of curses. To understand the gravity of what Matt Rife now controls, one must return to the couple who built this haunted empire. Ed and Lorraine Warren were not ordinary investigators. They devoted their lives to cases others would not even consider touching. Ed was a self-taught demonologist. Lorraine claimed clairvoyant abilities. Together, they became figures of controversy and fascination. The Warrens' home in Monroe, Connecticut, became more than a residence. It became a museum of the unexplained. Within its walls, hundreds of items were stored, each tied to a case, each believed to hold energy no one could fully explain. Over the decades, they claimed to investigate more than 10,000 cases. Their files inspired stories that reached the big screen. The Amityville haunting, the Perron family case that became The Conjuring, and many others. The museum itself was perhaps their most unsettling legacy. What began as a small collection grew into a dense archive of the paranormal. Crosses hung beside paintings said to carry curses. Mirrors were covered to prevent spirits from passing through. Statues, masks, trinkets, and ritual items filled cabinets. And then there was Annabelle, a Raggedy Ann doll locked in a glass case, marked with a sign that warned, "Do not open." The Annabelle doll became a cornerstone of the museum's notoriety. According to the Warrens, the doll was gifted to a young nurse in the 1970s. At first, it seemed harmless. Soon, strange notes appeared, written in childish scrawl, asking for help. The doll moved without being touched. A psychic medium declared it was inhabited by a spirit. What began as a curiosity turned into a nightmare. Visitors claimed scratches. One man mocked the doll in the museum and later died in a motorcycle crash. The Warrens kept Annabelle sealed, warning that she was not possessed by a human ghost, but by something darker that only imitated innocence. Annabelle was not the only piece with a disturbing reputation. There were satanic altars, occult paraphernalia, and relics taken from exorcisms. Each artifact carried with it stories of misfortune. For believers, this was the most dangerous private collection in the world. For skeptics, it was a theater of fear, but even skeptics found it difficult to linger in those dim rooms for long. When Matt Rife stepped into ownership, he did not just buy into history. He inserted himself into a conversation about legacy, responsibility, and danger. The museum had been closed since 2019 because of zoning disputes. Neighbors fought to keep the property from becoming a tourist attraction. The town of Monroe had no interest in swarms of ghost hunters crowding a residential street. For years, the artifacts sat in limbo, locked away, guarded, but unseen. Now, the story has shifted. Rife and his partner plan to revive the legacy. There are whispers of new museum sites, plans for immersive experiences, and even overnight stays beginning in November 2025. The idea is as thrilling as it is chilling, paying nearly $2,000 to sleep near objects some say should never be disturbed. Guests will sign liability waivers, promising they accept responsibility for anything, physical, psychological, or spiritual, that may happen. That alone raises questions. What does it mean when entertainment collides with something many people consider sacred and dangerous? Though Rife is called the owner, he is technically the legal guardian of the collection. Ownership remains a tangled matter involving the Warren estate and the artifacts themselves. In practice, however, he is the face of it. He is the one audiences will look to when strange stories begin to surface. Comedians thrive on stages, but stages can be controlled. A haunted artifact does not follow a script. The question that haunts every headline is simple. Why would he do it? Some believe it is a clever business move, tying his name to a cultural legend that guarantees endless publicity. Others think it is a genuine fascination, a passion for the paranormal that now has a physical home. But some whisper it is a mistake, an invitation to forces that should never have been touched. Step into the Warren Occult Museum and you do not feel like you are in a typical exhibit. You feel as though you have crossed a threshold into a place where rules bend. More than 750 artifacts line the rooms, each marked with a history of pain, fear, or ritual. There are no velvet ropes or polite descriptions to soften what they represent. These are not works of art, but reminders of darkness. The Warrens always insisted that these objects were not trophies. They were containment. They were cages for things that should never walk free. Every crucifix mounted on the wall, every glass cabinet, and every prayer recited before closing the door was not decoration, it was defense. Visitors would often leave pale, unsettled, and silent, as if the air itself had pressed on their lungs. Now, Matt Rife and Elton Casti have inherited that responsibility. They are not merely curators of a collection. They are wardens of objects that many believe were forged in tragedy and steeped in curses. At the heart of the museum sits Annabelle, small in size, unassuming in appearance, and yet carrying a reputation that eclipses all other items. Locked in her glass case, her ragged smile hides a story that terrifies even the skeptical. According to the Warrens, the doll was never haunted by a child's spirit, as some once believed. Instead, it was a vessel for something inhuman. The stories tied to Annabelle are grim. A young man who mocked her at the museum was told to leave by Ed Warren himself. The man allegedly laughed, tapped on the glass, and dared Annabelle to do her worst. Hours later, he was dead in a motorcycle accident. A coincidence? Perhaps. But the story has traveled farther than facts ever could. Even in recent years, rumors continue. Paranormal investigators who dared to interact with Annabelle reported unexplained scratches and sudden illness. Many believe that moving her from her original case, or even disturbing the protective prayers placed around her, risks unleashing her influence once again. And now, Annabelle belongs to Matt Rife, locked, contained, but still waiting. Another disturbing artifact is the Shadow Doll. Unlike Annabelle, it was never meant to look inviting. It was created to frighten. According to the Warrens, the Shadow Doll was used in occult rituals, sent to people in their dreams to terrify them until their hearts stopped. Small and grotesque, it radiates unease. People who stared too long at its twisted face often claimed to feel sick or dizzy. The Shadow Doll has been photographed countless times, yet the images often appear distorted, as if cameras resist capturing it clearly. Paranormal teams reported nightmares after spending time near it. The Warrens kept it sealed for good reason, and even speaking about it carried a weight that lingered long after the words were said. The museum also contains a mirror said to have been used in necromantic rituals. Known as the Conjuring Mirror, it was once owned by a man who used it to attempt to summon spirits. According to reports, he became obsessed with it, staring into the glass for hours at a time. He believed he had spoken with the dead, but his mind soon unraveled. The Warrens removed the mirror after claims of shadowy figures stepping from its surface. Visitors often say the mirror draws the eye. Some swear they see their reflections shift slightly out of sync. Others claim to see someone else staring back, even when they stand alone. It is the kind of artifact that does not need to move on its own to unsettle the soul. It unsettles because it suggests the boundary between worlds is thinner than we want to believe. Among the strangest items in the collection is a crude stone figure discovered in the woods of Connecticut. The Warrens called it a satanic idol. It was linked to animal sacrifices and strange rituals that terrified local residents. The figure was heavy, jagged, and unsettling in its presence. They believed it was tied to dark invocations, a physical anchor for malevolent intent. The idol was moved to the museum for safekeeping, but even there it seemed to project menace. People reported sudden headaches when standing near it. Paranormal researchers often felt as if they were being watched from its hollow eyes. It remains one of the most unnerving objects in the house, standing silent, yet never harmless. Beyond the famous items are countless smaller ones that still carry stories of unease. Masks used in rituals, their expressions frozen in grotesque smiles. Broken Ouija boards that once served as doorways for voices that refused to leave. Crucifixes scorched by fire, said to have leapt from walls during exorcisms. Each piece tells a story of someone's encounter with terror. The Warrens never displayed them as curiosities. They displayed them as warnings. Each artifact was an example of what can happen when curiosity crosses the line into obsession, when games turn into gateways, when rituals summon something that cannot be dismissed. For decades, skeptics scoffed at the idea that objects could be dangerous. Yet even though skeptics often felt a prickling unease in the museum, the environment was heavy, the rooms felt too quiet, the artifacts had presence, a weight that was difficult to deny. The Warrens often explained that these objects were like batteries, holding on to energy, replaying it, and radiating it. Even if one did not believe in spirits, the sheer history of suffering tied to them was enough to create psychological shadows. Imagine sleeping beside a doll that dozens of people swore was evil. Imagine walking past a mirror, believed to open doors to the dead. Even if nothing moved, the imagination could collapse under the pressure. Matt Rife now intends to make these artifacts accessible once more. That decision excites thousands, terrifies many more, and guarantees controversy. Because when objects tied to curses are disturbed, the stories do not stay quiet. They awaken, and they demand to be told again. For decades, the Warren Museum stood as a place of curiosity and controversy, but it was always limited. Visitors came in the daytime. Tours were guided and cautious. Now, Matt Rife and Elton Castee are preparing something entirely different. Beginning in November 2025, the museum will open for overnight stays. This is not just a casual tour. This is an invitation to spend the most vulnerable hours of the night in the company of artifacts said to harbor curses. The price alone sends a message: nearly $2,000 per night. For that cost, guests are not simply walking through a museum. They are surrendering themselves to the house, signing documents that release the guardians from responsibility for anything that might happen. The papers include spiritual disclaimers, acknowledging that unseen forces could cause physical or psychological harm. It reads less like a waiver and more like a warning whispered in candlelight. Guests will enter the Warren property at dusk. The first hours are designed to feel almost ordinary, a tour through rooms that feel like snapshots of another era. They will see the Annabelle case, the shadow doll, the idol, and the mirror. They will hear the stories tied to each item. But as midnight approaches, the tone will shift. At night, visitors will be given access to paranormal investigation tools. Electromagnetic field meters, thermal cameras, and spirit boxes will hum in the dark. The Guardians promise a blend of history and experimentation, but once the lights are low, the atmosphere will change from tour to trial. People who believe will brace themselves. People who doubt will laugh nervously. But even laughter does not sound comfortable in that house. The night will stretch on, and hours will pass slowly. Guests will try to sleep in rooms where shadows cling to corners. Silence will be broken by creaks and groans that may be wood settling or something else entirely. By morning, some will leave convinced that they felt a presence. Others will swear nothing happened at all, yet they will carry the weight of that uncertainty long after stepping outside. Critics argue that overnight stays are nothing more than theater. They say the mind creates fear out of darkness and history. That is partly true. Human imagination is a powerful engine, but even skeptics acknowledge that suggestion is not harmless. Fear can cause panic. Panic can cause accidents. A racing heart in a stressful environment can lead to real danger. Then there is the possibility, raised by believers, that the artifacts themselves respond to attention. That by inviting people to provoke, question, and challenge them, the Guardians are stirring forces that should remain quiet. History is filled with accounts of guests who mocked Annabelle or disrespected other artifacts, only to meet strange misfortune afterward. Whether coincidence or curse, the risk is enough to create unease. Despite the warnings, there is no shortage of demand. The allure is undeniable. People want to face the unknown. They want to step into the story rather than hear it secondhand. The combination of celebrity ownership, infamous artifacts, and the promise of danger creates a magnet that curiosity cannot resist. Matt Rife himself has joked that this will be the most expensive sleepover in the world. But beneath the humor is a serious gamble. Entertainment thrives on risk, but haunted artifacts do not follow scripts. If even one guest claims a terrifying encounter, the stories will spread faster than any marketing campaign. And if something truly dangerous happens, the consequences will be far beyond financial. Rife and Castee have positioned themselves as caretakers of history and fear. They claim their goal is preservation and education, not exploitation. They speak of creating an experience that honors the Warrens' legacy while modernizing it for a new generation. But every plan rests on a knife's edge. The more they open the doors, the more they risk losing control. The Warrens always warned that the museum was not for entertainment. They called it a place of containment, a shield against things that should not walk free. Turning that shield into a stage changes the balance. The question is simple: will this new chapter preserve the story or provoke the very forces the Warrens tried to restrain? The overnight stays are already dividing opinions. Some see them as thrilling adventures, others as reckless invitations to disaster. And beyond the guests themselves, there are louder voices rising in opposition: neighbors, critics, skeptics, and even those within the paranormal community. They all have one question: is this legacy being preserved or exploited? Reverence and outrage arrive together. The moment plans for expanded access became public, a chorus formed from uneasy neighbors, skeptical investigators, museum professionals, clergy, lawyers, and thrill seekers who wanted more than a selfie in a dark room. Accusations flew in both directions. Some claimed that the new stewards were reviving a legacy with intention and care. Others saw ambition sharpening its teeth on a brand built from grief and ritual. Between those positions stood a property in a quiet Connecticut town that never asked to host a national argument about fear. Neighbors spoke first because they had always lived in the shadow of the story. They remembered patrol cars lining the road in earlier years, remembered late-night whispers, remembered the flash of cameras when the curious came too close. They did not fear spirits as much as they feared headlights, noise, and strangers pacing the sidewalk at 2 a.m. They worried about traffic snarling school buses, about short-term rentals overflowing with guests who arrived hungry for stunts. They did not quote demonology, they quoted zoning codes. They wanted fewer emergencies, not more legends. Then came the skeptics, the ones who thrive on clean method and bright lights. They did not deny the power of a good story, but they pushed for controlled conditions if instruments would be used. They demanded baselines for electromagnetic readings, clear logging of temperature changes, careful control of cell phones and radios, documented floor vibrations, and multiple sealed cameras to guard against error or fraud. If the house would host overnight sessions, they asked for science to sit in the first row, not backstage. They argued that a claim is not evidence, and that fear can paint over the data until the numbers vanish. Paranormal researchers with long pedigrees stepped forward next, and their tone was not theatrical. It was weary and precise. They raised quiet questions about chain of custody, about which items had been moved, about how seals, prayers, or protections had been altered during transport. They urged restraint with a seriousness that sounded like grief. They did not argue against documentation or a responsible public program. They argued against provocation. They warned that loud demands for a reaction can twist an environment into danger faster than any ritual. They urged respect in the language used around objects that had once sat at the center of desperate homes. Conservators and museum professionals entered with a different vocabulary. They spoke of relative humidity, of mold spores, of UV damage, and the slow violence that comes from too much breath and too little climate control. They asked about archival storage, about nitrile gloves, about mounts that do not stress fabric or wood. They asked about fire suppression and the protocols for a collection described as volatile in every sense of the word. A relic might frighten an audience, but it still splits along a grain line when the air dries out. A cross can be dramatic and also fragile. A doll can terrify and still need a dust shield with a proper gasket. The language of preservation is quiet and relentless. It does not care about headlines, and it does not blink for cameras. Legal voices did not untie knots. They pointed at them. They asked where liability would land if a guest fell during a panic, if a trespasser slipped past a fence, if a prank escalated into violence. They asked whether waivers would withstand scrutiny, and whether insurance underwriters had measured the difference between ordinary tourism and a midnight experiment with nervous people and heavy furniture. They asked where emergency equipment would sit, who would be trained to use it, and how quickly a response team could thread through a residential grid when roads are lined with parked cars. The law did not argue about spirits. The law argued about bodies and consequences. Behind the practical concerns ran a darker current, the copycat effect. The more visible a storied place becomes, the more certain types of visitors appear. There are guests who arrive to pray or to learn, and there are guests who arrive to perform. There are those who whisper, and those who yell at the objects as if volume can force a door open. There are those who would damage something fragile for the thrill of making news. There are those who would stage a scare for attention and then insist the house did it. Security plans had to assume the worst, not the best. Cameras multiply, alarms multiply, staff multiply, the mood tightens. Social media made the debate feel like weather. 1 hour brought storms of praise, the next hour brought hailstones of scorn. Memes arrived by the dozen. So did long threads from historians who wanted the context restored. So did warnings from clergy who did not traffic in hashtags. Several urged that the property be approached like a church and a crime scene at once, with an ethic of care that treats the past as something sacred and the present as something easily wounded. They asked that guests be guided to sit in silence before speaking into the dark. They asked that the rules be printed in large letters and enforced without theater. The most surprising critics were some longtime paranormal personalities who had built careers on danger. They did not call for silence. They called for order. They described, in blunt terms, what happens when a room full of strangers begins to spiral. Vigilance drops when adrenaline spikes. People trip, people faint, people run blindly and fall downstairs. Someone always decides to be the hero and makes it worse. They described how one whispered dare can pull the entire group into a dare. That has nothing to do with spirits, they said, and everything to do with human beings under pressure. Their argument was simple. Do not build a situation you cannot hold if the mood turns. Journalists fanned the story with features that ricocheted between fascination and suspicion. Some pieces read like love letters to a modern Gothic revival. Others read like indictments of opportunism dressed in vintage wallpaper. Interviews snipped into sound bites. Clarifications pale beside a viral headline. Celebrities weighed in, some with a wink, some with a frown, a few with genuine thoughtfulness about what cultural memory looks like when it lives inside a suburban house. Through it all, the property remained a house with walls that heard every side. The rooms did not argue back, but they did not soothe either. Staff trained, fences were reinforced, waivers were edited to within an inch of legibility. Storage was reorganized, cases were tested, lights were mapped, a script for emergencies formed, not for entertainment, but for survival. Staff rehearsed lifting a guest who has crumpled. Staff rehearsed reversing the flow of a tour during an evacuation. Staff rehearsed telling someone to leave, calmly and without apology. What no one could rehearse was the split second at 2:13 a.m. when a visitor takes 3 shaky steps toward a case and decides to test a boundary. That is the moment everything would turn on. In that moment, rules meet appetite. The collection does not have to move. The people do. All the precautions are there to catch a human choice before it falls. That is the true tension beneath the public narrative. Not a doll rattling its case. A person reaching for a line because the story in the head insists that crossing lines is what stories are for. Experts from other haunted sites sent quiet messages with practical counsel. Separate the sleeping areas from the artifact areas. Keep a clean, bright room ready as a pressure release space. Limit groups. Limit alcohol long before arrival. Set a cap on time spent in the densest zones. Run carbon monoxide detectors because panic and poison feel similar at 3 in the morning. Keep a log for every incident, even the small ones, because patterns hide in small things. Pair every handler so no one is alone with a guest during peak fear. Follow every night with a debrief even if nothing happened, because nothing is a result that still needs understanding. Accusations of exploitation did not vanish, but some softened when plans rolled out that were meticulous, almost severe. Hard caps on capacity, strict start and stop times, clear bans on taunting, challenges, or personal rituals, a pledge to allocate a portion of revenue to conservation and to educational programs that explain the dangers of reckless ritual play, partnerships with counselors who can speak to trauma reactions, a serious ban on streaming live from inside the artifact rooms so that the urge to perform does not overtake the need to remain grounded. Still, controversy lingered like a smell you cannot name. There were people who would not be satisfied until the doors were shut forever, and the objects were boxed in a vault that never opens. There were people who would not be satisfied until the doors were open to anyone with a ticket and a flashlight. Between those poles lies the only workable path. Severe structure, measured access, a culture of respect that feels almost severe in its rules, a thrill born from sobriety rather than chaos, a night that moves like a liturgy instead of a dare. The loudest voices begin to tire. Even outrage runs out of breath. What remains are the steady hands who draw plans and hold them, the quiet experts who calibrate sensors and locks, the trainers who teach how to sit in darkness without inviting a stampede. The house becomes a test of adult attention. Can a program built on fear be run without feeding the appetite that fear creates? Can a story told at midnight remain a story rather than a spark? Beneath the public storm, another current runs, colder and closer to the bone. Some guests will arrive already carrying something heavy, grief, insomnia, panic nests. The house will press on those places. Staff will need to see trouble blooming in a face and move toward it without raising alarms. That is not paranormal, that is care. In a space where legend hums, the ordinary duties become sacred. To walk someone into the light, to steady a hand, to name the feeling correctly before it grows teeth. Those are the acts that keep a night from dissolving. When the town sleeps, the house listens to 1,000 new opinions drifting on the networked air. The fence holds, the alarms blink. Inside, a glass case gives a small tick as the building shifts. No headlines there, just thermal expansion, a lesson from science whispered under the breath of myth. It is in moments like that that the real shape of the plan reveals itself. The work is not simply to open a door. The work is to hold a door without letting the dark rush in or the crowd rush past. If the program succeeds, it will be because restraint turned out to be more frightening than spectacle, and because quiet turned out to be the strongest part of the show. Night by night, the backlash stops being a wave and starts being the background. Procedures replace argument. The story moves from press releases to incident reports that will never trend. The museum begins to feel less like a headline and more like a system. And within that system lives a final, inexhaustible question that no petition or policy can resolve. What will happen when a person who believes in nothing stands 6 inches from a case that other people have feared for 50 years? That is the hinge. That is the place where culture, history, psychology, and the possibility of something else lock together. The answer does not live in an article. It lives in a room at 3 a.m. when the house is at its fullest silence and a heartbeat begins to sound very loud. Imagine the night, from the first breath to the last. Check-in is orderly. The group small by design. The rules are firm and clear. The house is dim, not theatrical, but sober. An introduction settles the mood, and the hosts move the group through rooms that hold more history than space. The early hours pass with murmurs and device checks, notebooks and questions. Midnight crosses the threshold with no applause. The house deepens. The first failure will never be a ghost. It will be a person. The earliest risk is the most mundane. Someone trips because fear shortened their vision to a tunnel. A small fall can become a medical emergency when adrenaline is high and the stairs are steep. That is why the railings were chosen with so much attention, why the first aid kits sit within reach, why at least 2 staff members never move their eyes from the guests. The true crime eye notices the stair treads, the grip tape, the spacing of landing turns. Catastrophe hides in design flaws. Prevention hides in measurements that feel boring until they save a life. The second failure is the hoax. Someone fakes a whisper on a recorder, slides a coin when no one is watching, or taps a case in a way that looks like movement. The lie spreads faster than the correction because fear is a jet engine and truth is a bicycle. This is why redundant cameras exist, why body-worn audio recorders timestamp with precision, why an investigator's kit includes seals and numbered tags. Fraud is not only reputation damage, it is a corrupted archive that can mislead future teams and invite escalation. Once a group believes that the night is already extraordinary, pressure builds to make the next hour match the last. That is how people make bad choices. The third failure is anger. It grows when a guest feels ignored or embarrassed, and it looks at first like a raised voice. It becomes a shove or a graceless challenge to the house. Anger invites confrontation with objects that never ask to be tested. Anger turns a fragile environment into a stage for a personal drama. The staff's job is to read temperature, not the kind tied to a thermal camera, but the kind in a jawline and a breath. Calm language, clear boundaries, the power to remove once and without negotiation. The house cannot be allowed to serve as a prop in a tantrum. If trouble dodges those first 3 traps, the night can become a different sort of trial. The puzzle of meaningful silence. Sometimes nothing obvious happens. Devices barely blink. Floors sigh like any old structure. The group grows restless. Restlessness is the fourth failure. It lures people into unsafe experiments that begin with curiosity and end with regret. Someone suggests turning off every light and standing apart from one another. Someone suggests a dare that the rules forbid. Someone suggests speaking into the air with language meant to provoke. This is where the program either holds or shatters. A firm hand can redirect the energy. Remind the guests that the point is not noise but attention. The point is not to make something happen, but to witness whatever the house holds without trying to force the lid. Now imagine the opposite night, the one where the air feels charged as soon as midnight opens. Small oddities line up into a sequence. A cold patch holds in a corner that never felt cold before. A recorder captures a syllable that does not match any mouth in the room. Simple toys near a case tremble without a visible draft. An EMF meter rises in a way that eludes common sources. The best plan here is paradoxically smaller, not larger. Narrow the circle. Reduce motion. Let one observer narrate to the recorders. Too many reactions will trample the very thing the guests came to experience. The line between documentation and disturbance is thin enough to cut skin. Worst-case scenarios do not begin with demons. They begin with a guest who stops breathing well, or with an electrical fault, or with a trespasser who thinks folklore is a fence he can climb for fun. They begin with weather that turns power lines into snakes and roads into rivers. They begin with flashlights that die at the same time because no one checked the charging rack at dusk. A building built before modern codes has its own personality when the grid flickers. Panic loves darkness. The contingency plans read like a secular litany. Independent lanterns staged at fixed points, glow strips on thresholds, a manual bell to call the group to a bright room, a laminated map by every door, a charged phone in every pocket, emergency exits known by muscle memory, not by a sign. Some risks masquerade as respect. A guest brings an heirloom medal and asks to place it near a case for a blessing. Another wants to read a prayer from a tradition that the house did not grow from. Another whispers that they have brought a small object into the room that has troubled their family, hoping the museum air will settle it. The staff must say no with kindness and certainty. The house is not a clinic. It is not a laboratory for private rituals. Crossing that line draws stories into other stories and knots them together. Untying those knots can take years and leave splinters no one can see. There is also the copycat risk that does not arrive through the front door. Once the program gains attention, unsanctioned explorers will come after hours to try to steal a piece of the legend or to make their own. Locks can delay them, cameras can record them, police can remove them. But the simplest defense is cultural rather than physical, an atmosphere that says the museum is not a playground. The more the official program models sobriety, the less thrill there is in breaking in to act wildly. People mimic tones as much as behaviors. The night teaches by the way it moves. Imagine a sequence that slips toward tragedy, even with all precautions. A guest collapses. Staff stabilize, call, and clear. Sirens approach. The house becomes a scene again, not in the haunted sense, but in the legal sense. Reports must be exact. Timelines must be crisp. Cameras must be preserved. The team must be able to show what happened, minute by minute, without gaps that invite speculation to breed. True crime lessons repeat here. Details save lives and reputations. Precision is mercy. There is another path the night can take, quieter and stranger. A guest who arrived swinging jokes decides, without announcing it, to sit still for 20 minutes in the smallest room. Something about the quiet trips a wire inside a memory. Tears arrive without drama. The house can do that, not because it reaches out with invisible hands, but because a museum built from fear has a way of showing people their own. Staff need to recognize when the encounter has become personal rather than paranormal. A chair, a cup of water, a softened tone, and a walk to the fresh air can be the difference between a memory and a scar. Why do people go knowing all this? They go because human beings want to test edges. They go because standing in a room that holds cultural terror feels like pressing a finger to a bruise. They go because the story of the Warrens and their cases has woven itself into modern folklore, and folklore is a mirror you can carry. They go to brag, they go to heal, they go to argue with fear until fear blinks. Every motive enters the door and changes the room. The program cannot cure motive. It can shape it, slow it, and give it rails to run on. What about the question that walks quietly through every paragraph so far? Could the objects truly act? The script refuses certainty because certainty here would be dishonest. Stories exist that are difficult to shrug off. There are tapes, there are logs, there are scars that people point to, and there are coincidences so sharp they cut. There are also errors, hoaxes, and the long reach of suggestion. A rigorous night does not promise proof. It promises a well-lit corridor where experience can step without breaking its ankle. If anything moves, the room will be ready to see it. If nothing moves, the room will be ready to accept the dark as an honest answer. In the long view, the museum will succeed or fail on one principle that looks small and is not: the ability to leave the room the same way it was found. That means glass unmarked, cases intact, logs accurate, guests upright, staff steady, neighbors asleep, police radios quiet, the house uninjured, and the night stored rather than spent. It also means resisting the urge to escalate because escalation sells. The history already carries enough voltage to light a city. It does not need more sparks. The finale of such a script cannot be fireworks. Fireworks are for arenas. A house built from prayer, ritual, and fear asks for a different ending. It asks you to notice your breath in the last hallway. It asks you to feel your foot hit the final stair and to count that as a kind of victory. It asks you to step outside and find that the air smells different, not because anything supernatural exhaled, but because you were holding your own lungs too tightly for too long. The program sends you away with that awareness, and with one last important practice. Say the name of the street, the name of the town, the names of the people who live nearby, and did not ask for your fear to spill into their sleep. Speak those names with respect, because that is what keeps a legend from becoming a mess. If the collection stirs, it will not be on command. It will not be during the loudest demand or the rudest dare. It will be when the group is packing up and two guests pause to look over their shoulders. The room may feel slightly out of alignment for one heartbeat. The hair on an arm may lift. A glass may make a small click as the temperature shifts. Or nothing will happen at all, and the most haunting thing will be the way the ordinary refuses to bend. Either way, the night will offer a choice. Carry the story like a sparkler, waving it for attention, or carry it like a candle cupped by a hand, respectful of wind and darkness. And the future of the museum under its modern stewards will not be decided by a single viral night, but by 1,000 small decisions that never make a headline. Choose trained staff over charisma, choose logs over lore, choose silence over provocation, choose smaller groups over larger profits, choose the neighbor's sleep over a dramatic flourish at 2 a.m. None of those choices photographs well. All of them build a house that can carry the weight of a dangerous history. A final thought moves in like a shadow and stops in the threshold. People do not fear dolls, mirrors, or carved idols by themselves. People fear what those things might be evidence of, that the world is not as sealed as it feels on a sunny afternoon, that the door between grief and presence is thinner than it looks, that memory does not merely describe the past, but can also shape the present. Whether the artifacts manifest or remain stubbornly still, they have already done something undeniable. They have gathered people into a room to sit with the question of what is real and what is story. That gathering is powerful. Handle it carefully. As the last lamp goes dark and a staff member locks the door, the house returns to its natural state. Not a stage, not a circus, not a sermon. A structure that holds echoes. The artifacts rest in their stations. The air unspools. The fence line waits for morning. Somewhere, a neighbor's dog turns once in a circle and sleeps. There is a holiness in that plainness. There is a warning in it too. The most frightening stories are not the ones that shatter the laws of nature. The most frightening stories are the ones that tell us how thin our own balance is, and how easily a crowd, a legend, and a night can tip. When guests come back to life the next day and recount what they felt, they will emphasize the moments that glowed in the mind. A whisper that might have been a pipe. A cold place that did not behave like a draft. A sudden sting of tears that arrived with no obvious cause. They will disagree about what it means. That disagreement is honest. It keeps the door ajar without pushing anyone through. It lets believers remain brave and skeptics remain sane. It lets a museum be a museum instead of a verdict. There is one last scene you should hold like a photograph. A guest stands beneath a tree outside the house just before dawn. The street is empty. The sky is a deep blue that has not yet softened. The guest looks up at an upstairs window and feels nothing dramatic, only a steadiness that is new. The night did not answer the largest questions. It did something smaller and stranger. It taught the guest to notice how fast a heartbeat can sound, how easily a story can take the lead, and how strong the urge is to force an ending where none belongs. The guest breathes. The guest turns away from the window. The town wakes. That is what to expect from a program that respects both the living and the dead. Not fireworks, not a brawl with the invisible, but a clean, careful, unnerving walk along the border, where history, fear, and restraint meet. You will leave with your own pulse in your ears, and the sense that the ordinary world is the prize you just won back. And if, somewhere in the hours ahead, you hear a faint click from a case in an empty room, you will not know whether it was a building settling or a legend turning over in its sleep. You will know only this: you stood on the edge and did not fall. I know this was a long one, but if you made it this far, please give this video a like, and please consider subscribing. Also, down in the comments, let me know what haunted place you want me to cover next. Thank you.